Every time someone tells you to build an online business, they make one thing sound incredibly simple. Just spend an hour a day after work, stay consistent, and eventually it'll all pay off. For a long time, I believed that too. So every evening, I'd sit down at my desk, open my laptop, set aside an hour, and tell myself, tonight is the night I finally make real progress. Most nights looked surprisingly productive. Browser tabs filled the screen, my notebook collected more ideas, and another AI tool promised to save me hours. By the end of the night, it felt like I'd been busy. The problem was that busy and productive weren't the same thing. I'd close my laptop feeling exhausted, but if someone asked what I'd actually built, I didn't have a good answer. That made me wonder whether the problem was never the hour itself. Maybe the problem was everything I allowed to happen inside that hour. So I designed a simple experiment. For the next 7 days, I'd spend exactly 1 hour each evening building a second income, but I'd completely changed the rules for how that hour worked. No jumping between business ideas, no watching tutorials, no researching competitors' sites. Once the timer started, the only thing I was allowed to do was create something that didn't exist an hour earlier. It sounds obvious, but it felt strangely uncomfortable. I'd become so used to preparing that sitting down and immediately building felt almost reckless. Before I started, I wrote one sentence across the top of a blank notebook. Output before input. Every decision I made during the week had to pass that one simple test. I didn't know whether 7 hours would produce a business, a product, or absolutely nothing. But by the end of the week, I wanted an answer to a much more important question. Can one focused hour actually change anything? The first thing I did wasn't open my laptop. I opened my notebook instead. Before touching a keyboard, I wrote down exactly what success would look like after 7 hours of work. Not revenue, not subscribers, not a finished business. My goal was much smaller than that. By the end of the week, I wanted one real thing that somebody else could actually use, buy, or respond to. That decision immediately removed a surprising amount of pressure. Instead of trying to build an entire business, I was simply trying to finish one useful asset. I think that's where a lot of us get stuck. We try to build the company before we've built the first brick. The size of the goal becomes an excuse to delay the first piece of work. So I made another rule. Every evening had to end with something visible. A document, a landing page, a product, a thumbnail, a script, something I could point to and say, that didn't exist an hour ago. It didn't matter whether it was good. It mattered that it was finished enough to become tomorrow's starting point instead of tomorrow's idea. That became the first lesson of the experiment. Momentum doesn't come from motivation. It comes from reducing the distance between starting and finishing. Looking back, I'd been measuring progress completely the wrong way. I counted hours spent, videos watched, and notes taken. None of those things actually moved me closer to earning an online income. So I replaced one question with another. Instead of asking, did I work hard tonight? I started asking, what can I show for tonight's hour? That single question quietly changed how every decision was made. If an activity didn't leave something behind that I could improve tomorrow, it probably didn't belong inside my 1 hour window. The experiment had officially begun. The timer was set. The distractions were gone. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to learn how to build an online business. I was finally building one. The first night went well for about 20 minutes. I had a blank document open, a timer counting down beside me, and one clear task. Then my brain immediately started looking for an escape route. I wanted to check one tutorial, then another tool, then maybe compare 3 different platforms before committing. None of those things were necessary, but all of them felt safer than making a decision. So I made the rule stricter. During the hour, research was only allowed if I hit a specific obstacle that physically stopped me from continuing. Curiosity didn't count, uncertainty didn't count, confusion did. That distinction was surprisingly useful. Most of the time, I wasn't actually blocked. I was uncomfortable. And I'd been treating discomfort like a problem that needed more information. Once I stopped doing that, the work became much simpler. I chose the next visible action, finished it, and moved on. Open the document, write the first section, create the next page, keep going. The second lesson appeared almost by accident. 1 hour feels tiny when you're imagining a whole business, but it feels enormous when the task is specific enough to finish. That's when I started breaking every session into one outcome. Not work on the business, something concrete, like finish the landing page, write the offer, or build the first usable version. The difference was immediate. A vague task invited distraction. A finished outcome created urgency. The timer stopped feeling like pressure and started feeling like a boundary. And that boundary mattered because I knew the hour would end whether I was ready or not. I couldn't keep polishing forever. At some point, the work had to become good enough to exist. By the middle of the week, the experiment had already answered one question. Limited time wasn't automatically the problem. The bigger problem was how much of that time I'd previously spent avoiding decisions. By the end of the third evening, my desk looked completely different. There were fewer open tabs, fewer half-finished ideas, and one growing project that looked more complete every single night. That surprised me because the total amount of work hadn't really changed. I was still spending 1 hour after work. And the difference was that every hour connected to the one before it instead of starting from scratch. I'd never realized how much energy I wasted restarting. Every evening, I used to rethink the business, rethink the strategy, and rethink the tools. It felt flexible, but it quietly reset my momentum. This experiment removed that choice. Yesterday's work became today's starting point. The only question I had to answer was, what's the next visible piece? I think that's a lesson that applies far beyond online business. Momentum isn't built by working harder, it's built by reducing the number of decisions between where you are and the next meaningful action. The project itself almost became secondary. What I was really building was a repeatable system that made showing up tomorrow easier than showing up yesterday. And that's when I noticed something I wasn't expecting. I stopped thinking about whether the idea would succeed. My attention shifted towards whether I was keeping the promises I'd made to myself. That change was incredibly freeing. Success was no longer something controlled by an algorithm, a customer, or the market. Success became finishing the hour exactly as I'd planned. Ironically, once I stopped obsessing over the outcome, the quality of my work started improving. I wasn't rushing to finish. I was simply giving one task my full attention before moving on. By the end of the week, I realized the biggest result of the experiment wasn't the project sitting on my laptop. It was the person sitting in front of it. I was finally behaving like someone who builds instead of someone who prepares. When I looked back over the week, I realized this experiment wasn't really about time. It was about designing an environment where progress became the easiest option instead of the hardest one. Without meaning to, I'd created a simple system that anyone could repeat. It wasn't complicated, and that was probably why it worked. Every evening followed exactly the same sequence. First, decide one outcome before the hour begins, not a vague intention. One visible piece of work that someone else could recognize if they looked over your shoulder. Second, remove every decision that doesn't help complete that outcome. Close the extra tabs. Put the phone away. Ignore every idea that isn't today's job. Third, stop the moment the hour finishes, even if you could keep going. Leaving something unfinished gives tomorrow's session a place to begin instead of another reason to procrastinate. Finally, end every session by asking one question. What exists now that didn't exist 60 minutes ago? If you can answer that clearly, the hour was a success. That's the framework I'll be using from now on. Not because it's perfect, but because it's the first system that's consistently helped me finish more than I start. And the interesting thing is that none of those 4 steps require motivation. They only require a decision that's already been made before the timer begins. I still don't know whether this project will become a meaningful second income. Nobody can honestly promise that after 7 hours of work. But I do know that I'm making measurable progress instead of imagined progress. For me, that's the biggest difference. I haven't found a shortcut. I've simply found a way to make tomorrow's version of myself a little more likely to sit down, press start, and keep building. That might not sound revolutionary, but if you've spent months waiting for the perfect idea like I did, you'll know that consistently finishing small pieces of work is often the breakthrough that changes everything.